We all remember that Thanksgiving night in 2009. The fire hydrant. The shattered glass. The world's most famous marriage imploding in real time on a quiet Florida street in the early hours of the morning. For years, Illy Nordegren existed in the public imagination as little more than a footnote to someone else's story. The silent, beautiful wife standing in the gallery while her husband rewrote sporting history. She was defined entirely by his shadow and, ultimately, by his scandals. But to see Illy today, in 2026, is to experience something genuinely surprising. She didn't merely survive the wreckage of one of the most public marital collapses in modern history. She used it as raw material, forging from the debris a life so grounded, so deliberate, and so entirely her own that it almost defies belief. The transformation people expected from Illy Nordegren was a predictable one. Perhaps a revenge glow-up splashed across the covers of glossy magazines, a reality television contract, a wellness brand, or a string of high-profile relationships designed to send a message. What she delivered instead was something far more radical. She became entirely, stubbornly normal. To encounter her today at a youth sports complex in South Florida, clutching a lukewarm coffee, dressed in a sensible linen blazer, managing a small army of children with calm efficiency, is to witness a person who has performed the most impressive vanishing act imaginable. She didn't just leave a marriage. She left the very concept of celebrity behind, and in doing so, became infinitely more interesting than any tabloid version of herself could ever have been. At 46, Illy possesses the kind of weathered serenity that cannot be purchased or performed. It is the serenity of a person who walked directly through a Category 5 social hurricane and came out the other side with a dignity not just intact, but deepened. The most immediate shock for those who haven't followed her story is the mathematics of her current life. For those who still picture her with just Sam and Charlie, the two children she shares with Tiger Woods, the reality of 2026 requires a moment of adjustment. Since 2019, Illy and her partner, former NFL star Jordan Cameron, have built a sprawling, blended family. Together they have 3 young children, Zeta, Freya, and Arthur. And alongside Jordan's son from a previous relationship, Illy is now the heart of a household of 6 children. The Swedish nanny who once cared for the families of the global elite is now the chief executive of a domestic operation that requires more daily logistics than a professional golf tour. But the most extraordinary detail in the story of Illy Nordegren's reinvention has nothing to do with her family. It is found on her office door. While the world waited for her to sell her story, to sit across from a sympathetic television host and deliver the tearful, cathartic interview that everyone assumed was inevitable, Illy was quietly sitting in a classroom at Rollins College. She didn't enroll for the optics, and she didn't drop out when the cameras moved on. She stayed for a decade, earning a degree in psychology with a 3.96 GPA and graduating as the commencement speaker in 2014. Today, she is a licensed mental health counselor running her own private practice, EN Therapy. The poetic irony is almost too rich to absorb. The woman whose private trauma was dissected and consumed by every tabloid publication on the planet now spends her working days helping other people navigate their own emotional wreckage. She took the shards of her shattered life and ground them into a lens through which others can finally see clearly. Her relationship with Tiger Woods himself has, by 2026, reached a state of grace that once seemed unthinkable. They are not merely cordial co-parents exchanging polite nods at school events. By all accounts, they are genuine allies. When their son Charlie received his state championship ring earlier this year, Illy stood just inches from her former husband, laughing with the ease of 2 people who have long since made peace with a complicated past. This is perhaps the deepest dimension of her transformation. She refused both available roles. She refused to be the victim, and she refused to be the villain. She chose instead to be something far more difficult, a healer. The woman visible in 2026 is not Tiger's ex. She is a mother, a clinician, and living proof that the most devastating public explosion of your life does not have to be your defining chapter. To fully appreciate who Illy Nordegren is today, it helps to remember who she was before any of it began. Long before the private jets and the billion-dollar headlines, Illy and her twin sister Josephine were working summer jobs at a clothing store in Stockholm to fund their studies. Hers was a life of clean Swedish sensibilities, hard work, privacy, and quiet ambition. The pivot that would change everything came not through any grand design, but through a simple job offer, a position as a nanny for Swedish golfer Jesper Parnevik, whose family was based in Florida. She wasn't chasing fame or fortune when she packed her bags for America. She was chasing a way to pay for her psychology textbooks. When she first encountered Tiger Woods, then the undisputed deity of the sporting world, she was notably unimpressed. She turned him down initially. She was a young woman with her own academic goals, uninterested in the ego-driven circus that surrounded the world's #1 athlete. This early display of independence was the first clear signal of the character she would later demonstrate under far greater pressure. Tiger, however, was persistent, and the courtship that followed was a study in contrasts, the loud, commercialized American dream meeting the quiet, reserved Swedish reality. For a few years, the tension between those two worlds seemed to produce something genuinely beautiful. As their relationship deepened in the early 2000s, Illy became what the golf world called the silent queen of the PGA Tour. She appeared in the gallery at tournaments, fiercely protective of their private life, never granting interviews, never seeking the microphone. Friends from that era describe her as someone who was always reading, always observing, always quietly preparing for a life that extended well beyond the fairways. While Tiger was perfecting his swing, Illy was perfecting the art of being invisible in the middle of a stadium, a skill that, in hindsight, was also a form of self-preservation. She was learning, in real time, the cost of greatness and the price of the deceptions being kept just out of her sight. Their wedding in October 2004 was one of the most extravagant private ceremonies the world has ever seen. Tiger rented the entire 112-room Sandy Lane resort in Barbados for over a week, chartered every helicopter on the island, and secured the only local boat company to ensure complete privacy from the press. Under a white-netted pagoda decorated with 10,000 black roses flown in from around the globe, Illy stood at 24 years old as the picture of effortless elegance. Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and Oprah Winfrey were among the guests. Hootie and the Blowfish performed under a massive tent. The evening concluded with a fireworks display visible for miles along the Barbados coast. The newlyweds spent their first night aboard a 155-foot luxury yacht named, with striking irony, Privacy. It was a $10 million sunset that promised a lifetime of untouchable happiness. The creative irony of that name, viewed from 2026, is almost unbearable. The years that followed settled into a life of surface perfection. Their daughter Sam was born in 2007, their son Charlie in early 2009. Illy threw herself into motherhood with fierce intensity, often seen pushing a stroller through the gated streets of Isleworth, deliberately removed from the cameras that followed her husband everywhere. But beneath the domestic composure, the foundations were already rotting. Tiger's dominance on the course was matched by the complexity of a double life being lived just beyond Illy's field of vision. The golden couple image that the world consumed was being maintained by a small army of handlers, fixers, and security personnel whose primary function was the preservation of the brand. Illy was arguably the most famous wife in the world and, in many ways, the most alone, isolated in a foreign country, surrounded by people whose loyalty was not to her. Then came November 27, 2009. At 2:25 in the morning, a black Cadillac Escalade lurched out of the driveway of the Woods Isleworth mansion, clipped a fire hydrant, and collided with a neighbor's tree. When police arrived, they found Tiger Woods lying semi-conscious on the ground, bleeding from the mouth, with Illy standing over him holding a golf club. The initial story released by Tiger's team framed Illy as a hero. She had heard the crash, grabbed the nearest club, and smashed the rear window to pull her husband to safety. Within 48 hours, the story began to unravel. Why was Tiger leaving the house at 2:30 in the morning? Why did the crash happen just yards from his own front door? And why would smashing the back window be necessary to rescue a driver from a low-speed collision? The questions multiplied rapidly. A report in the National Enquirer, published just 2 days before the crash, had alleged an affair. As more details leaked, the narrative shifted completely. The shattered glass of the Cadillac became the shattered glass of the $10 million sunset, and as the sun rose over Florida that morning, the privacy they had spent millions to construct was gone forever. What followed for Illy was a public autopsy of her marriage conducted in front of a global audience. A parade of women emerged over the following weeks, each claiming a piece of the Tiger Woods story, each new revelation landing like another blow. It was the total, violent deconstruction of a woman's reality in front of hundreds of millions of people. Yet even in the eye of that storm, Illy retreated into silence, not the silence of a woman protecting her husband, but the silence of a woman choosing herself. She didn't grant the interviews. She didn't sell the photographs. She waited for the smoke to clear, and when it did, she began the long, quiet walk toward a different life. The $100 million divorce settlement that followed was described by many in the media as hush money. It was not. Her silence was never for sale. It was, and always had been, her natural state of dignity. She took that financial foundation and invested it in something the tabloids never anticipated: her mind. She enrolled at Rollins College not as a celebrity stunt, but as an act of genuine intellectual pursuit, spending nearly a decade studying the mechanics of trauma, human behavior, and emotional resilience, the very forces that had shaped and nearly destroyed her own life. The Illy Nordegren of 2026 has achieved something that very few people in the orbit of enormously famous men ever manage. She has eclipsed the shadow entirely. In her private therapy practice, she is not Tiger's former partner. She is a clinician. She is a working professional with a full household and a career built on earned expertise. The Tiger's X label has finally fallen away, not because time eroded it, but because she outgrew it. She didn't survive the 2009 firestorm so much as she used its heat to forge a version of herself entirely unrecognizable from the girl who once packed a suitcase in Stockholm for a nannying job in Florida. She walked away from the blast zone. She built a garden in the quiet space beyond it. And the woman standing in the Florida sunshine in 2026, surrounded by her 6 children, grounded in her work, and at peace with her complicated history, is the most compelling proof that the most public rock bottom of your life does not have to be your final chapter. It can be, if you have the courage and the discipline to choose it, the very foundation on which everything real is built.